Hello, everybody. Mr. Porter here for the beginning of Unit 7. We have taken the test for Units 5 and 6. And here we go into 7.1. We are moving into pretty much the 20th century, except for the Spanish-American War. And you'll notice on the vocabulary, it starts out with the causes of four wars. And let's take the Spanish-American War first. The Spanish-American War was kind of interesting because the higher-ups in the United States government at that time favored, I guess, being nice, for lack of a better word, being very nice to the Cubans. And the Cubans really wanted the Spanish out. There were many people in the higher parts of the government, namely the president, William McKinley, who wanted to do that diplomatically. And in fact, it was kind of interesting that I'm trying to figure out really why they would want to send the USS Maine, which was a battleship, into Havana Harbor. And I think really it was just a show of force to the Spanish. The reasons that, that the cause was really that we wanted to help not only the Cubans, but also the Filipinos. We have to remember that the Philippines belonged to Spain as well. We wanted to help them get rid of the Spaniards. And, of course, as fate would have it, you had the Maine, the USS Maine, blow up. I mean, it exploded in Havana Harbor. And, of course, what did the newspapers say at the time? Oh, the Spanish blew it up. The Spanish planted a bomb and it exploded. That's something, and we'll talk about this. This is yellow journalism that we'll talk about in just a minute. But after we get done with the causes of all of these wars, but that really pushed Congress essentially into declaring war against Spain. That, you could say it was just the Maine that was the cause, but it's much more than that. Much more than that. The cause of the Philippine War is that, the Filipinos essentially went from one big country to another. They had Spain that was essentially over, it was a territory of Spain. And the Filipinos wanted independence. And here, the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos loved the Americans, kicked the Spaniards out. But unfortunately for the Filipinos, the Americans were essentially given the right to the Philippines by the Spanish government. In fact, they deeded the Philippines over to the United States at the end of the Spanish-American War, and the Filipinos didn't like that a whole lot, and so you had probably 2-3 years anyway of fairly intense fighting, and after that, it was a lot of guerrilla skirmishes. With the jungles of the Philippines, it's not very difficult to have some guerrilla warfare, as the United States found out in Vietnam. But anyway, it got to the point down the road in the late 1930s, and in fact, after Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, the Filipinos found out just how much better the United States was, more of an ally than anything else, and in the war against the Japanese in World War II, the Filipinos were a staunch ally of the United States because they both had the idea of getting the Japanese out of the Philippines. And less than a year after the end of World War II, the United States granted independence to the Philippines. Funny enough, on July 4th, 1946. Cause of World War I really could almost be boiled down to one thing, and that was the nationalism of Croatia, and several of the other. You look at what Yugoslavia is today. Okay, there is no Yugoslavia, right? You've got Croatia, you've got Macedonia, you've got Bosnia Herzegovina, you've got just all of these different national, just really they're ethnic areas, and that's where they ran into some problems down the road, and we'll find out about that really on Monday with human rights abuses in Yugoslavia after the fall of communism. But in World War I, the reason was a Croatian separatist. Croatia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the next in line to the throne was actually in Sarajevo. And he ended up being assassinated. And so within a few days, the Austro-Hungarian army was invading Croatia, and that was the beginning. That was the very beginning of World War I. And of course, World War II, Germany and Europe, September 1st, 1939, they invade Poland. Poland was using horses. Just crazy stuff. And later on, Germany was using horses for transportation, and and I recall watching a mini series called Band of Brothers. You probably have heard of it, but about that. And Germany was still using horses in 1944 for transportation and to move material back and forth. They were, drawing. The horses were pulling wagons, and I just remember, when the German army was, 3/4 of it had surrendered. You had a large onslaught of U.S. military vehicles going up one of the autobahns, and some German officers are in the back of a wagon being pulled by a couple of horses. And one of these guys say hello to Ford and General Motors. What were you thinking? You've got horses. Which was very true. Did they have a great deal of technology at their disposal? Oh, absolutely. But they were still, in many cases, stuck in the Dark Ages with horses and with wagons. And I think the problem that they ran into was a problem of fuel. And that's one of the problems that happened after D-Day, was a lot of their tanks, etc., ran out of fuel, and the tank crews were abandoning the tanks. And so that was the problem that they ran into. And of course, with the theater in Asia, or should I say in the Pacific Theater, that had to do with Japan bombing Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, that effectively pulled hook, line, and sinker the United States into the war. They did not want to be in the war, and we'll find this out in just a couple of minutes. Anyway, imperialism. We've talked about that before, right? It's the one powerful nation exerting Usually, well, in many cases anyway, diplomatic power to control other smaller countries. But in several cases, they were exerting military power to control those smaller countries. And that's where you end up with the imperialism. And, if you want to call the United States an imperial nation, by all means, go ahead, because the United States is an imperial nation. We have, as a country, we have holdings all over the world as far as territories are concerned. Not only in the Pacific, but also in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. A lot of people don't realize that the U.S. Virgin Islands are called the U.S. Virgin Islands for a very good reason, and that's because they're territories of the United States. You don't have to have a passport to travel there. Anyway, yellow journalism. That's what I wanted to get to. That was the main cause of the United States getting into the war with Spain. Yellow journalism is grandiose. It's over-exaggerated stuff. If you ever go to the grocery store, you go to the checkout counter, and there's usually some magazines or some newspapers that are up there, but they're not regular newspapers. It's not like The Item or the Sun News in the Myrtle Beach area, or The State in Columbia. No, those it's not those papers. What it is, you have the National Enquirer, you have News of the World, and something like things like that. And what those are referred to as tabloids. In other words, these are the yellow journalism of today. Grandiose, exaggerated. What they like to really have these overblown stories to try to get people to buy their paper. Excuse me. And that's what happened to get the United States into the Spanish-American War. Excuse me. To fight Spain. And they took the ball and ran with it when the USS Maine blew up. And it ended up that Congress bought into it, and they ended up declaring war on Spain as a result. And it was really overblown because of what happened with the yellow journalism. What was it that William Randolph Hearst, who was probably the biggest yellow journalist person, he was a major publisher of newspapers. Hearst, the Hearst company now owns, not only that, they own television stations, they own radio stations, newspapers still. But one thing that he said, I can. It was something along the lines that if you want a war, I can find one for you, type of thing. So, okay, social Darwinism. We've talked about that. Survival of the fittest, economically, socially, politically, that type of thing. It's been debunked. It's a bunch of garbage. People that felt that they were above everyone else, really. Jingoism. I think, if you want nativism to the next level, that's sort of what jingoism is. That your country is the best, okay, and that everyone was below you, and it was enthusiastic support for the country. I've seen that a few times in my lifetime. Saw that during the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid, New York, when the hockey team, the USA hockey team, beat the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union hockey players were professionals. I mean, that's all they did was play hockey. Okay? They were in the army but all they did was play hockey. Okay, so they weren't soldiers; they were professional hockey players, and that was a major thing because these were the kids that beat them were young college students that ended up beating them. And of course, now they use NHL players and in the Olympics and NBA players in basketball. But that was huge because when in the closing seconds, it was Al Michaels that said, "Do you believe in miracles?" And there were chants from the crowd, "USA, USA, USA." That's jingoism, okay? For a moment there during the 1980 Olympics, yeah, people were pretty proud to be an American, and we felt that our country was the best. Now, isolationism versus interventionism, very, very simple to remember. Isolationism, you stay to yourself. In other words, you remain neutral. Interventionism is when you get involved in the war. Now, obviously, World War I and World War II, the U.S. was an isolationist until finally push came to shove with a couple of different things, and it dragged us into the war. So we went from being isolationist to being an interventionist. And again, right after the end of the war, boom, back to isolationism until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And then they dragged the United States kicking and screaming from isolationism to interventionism again. So those two terms are two terms that you really should remember. The U-boat attacks. That's one of the things that dragged us into the war. The Germans decided, they had these U-boats, the earliest submarines, let's say that. Well, the earliest submarines were back during the Civil War, but these were very good submarines that the Germans had. They had them starting in World War I, where they were very, very dangerous for all shipping in the North Atlantic. And the Germans said to the Americans, they didn't want the Americans in the war. They said, okay, we'll hold off. We won't have our U-boats torpedo any more ships. We'll hold that off. We'll put a moratorium on that. And that lasted all of like 2 or 3 months. And they decided, nope, we're going back to it. Too bad. So sad, and they started doing that again. And then there were a couple of other things that happened that dragged the United States into the war. The League of Nations, this is something that you really need to remember. You really need to understand what this was. The League of Nations was part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. Okay? Our president, who was Woodrow Wilson, okay, he went over to France to help craft this Treaty of Versailles. And part of the Treaty of Versailles was creating this League of Nations. I'll clue you in. It's sort of like the United Nations today. Okay? Same type of thing. And so the League of Nations was created, but there was one little problem. The U.S. Senate had to approve the treaty, and they wouldn't. In fact, that was the problem with the whole thing. The U.S., it was Woodrow Wilson's idea for the League of Nations, and the United States was not involved at all with the League of Nations. They did not sign the treaty, and it was not ratified by the Senate. So, there were a lot of reasons involved, but one of the main ones was they did not want have to put boots on the ground again for a European squabble in like 2 or 3 years. They just didn't want to have that happen. Even though 20 years later they did have boots on the ground in Europe for a major war that erupted. Pearl Harbor, of course, the Japanese destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet, in one fell swoop. And that's just one of the problems of having the entire fleet leaving San Diego and going to Pearl Harbor. And of course, we still have a couple of ships on the bottom at Pearl Harbor today, with the Arizona Memorial and a couple of others. The Lend-Lease Act is something that the U.S. did with other countries, and we're talking Great Britain, we're talking Free France, we're talking China, okay, which we know today as the People's Republic of China or Communist China. They were our ally during World War II, and prior to it, by the way. Also, the Soviet Union. We gave material to them. I kind of laugh, to myself, thinking of a General Motors or a Ford truck rambling through the Soviet Union. It's just kind of comical to think about, really. But that's what they did. They would actually either lend it, essentially give it to them, or they would lease this material, and this would be not only trucks, but tanks, ammunition, other types of hardware as well. And it wasn't just these countries. Also, Australia, New Zealand. There were countries actually in South America that received stuff from the Lend-Lease Act. So it wasn't just our main allies; it was others as well. And the Atlantic Charter. Get this, guys. The United States isn't even in World War II, and Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, meet together. I believe it was up in Newfoundland. Yeah, it was up in Newfoundland, and they kind of plan out how the world's going to be after the war, and the United States hasn't even gotten into it yet. Okay, this was in 1940. It was actually it was in 1941. They decided to meet in late 1940. The meeting finally took place in August of 1941. U.S. wasn't even in the war yet. Okay, we're talking 5 months, 4 or 5 months later. Pearl Harbor gets bombed. I don't know if there's a correlation there, but anyway. They wanted to decide what was going to happen not only during the war but after the war, and it kind of hilarious how that worked out. And then of course the last one is destroyers for bases, and that was something the United States did. They pulled a bunch of ships, bunch of destroyers out of mothballs. Okay. Weren't even using them anymore. Gave them to Great Britain to allow us to have bases there in Great Britain, and so this was in 1940, and so it pretty much set the United States up for what would end up happening on D-Day, and we'll get into that part as well. All right. Now, that's the vocabulary for today. Now, I said I was going to give you instructions on the T-chart, and the T-chart goes over the 4 wars. It's in 4 sections. It's 2 up above, 2 down below. So you've got the Spanish-American War, you've got the Filipino War, you've got World War I and World War II. Okay, this is what I need from you. Number 1, I need the years of the wars. Okay? Shouldn't be hard to find. Number 2, I need the main participants. Now, obviously, for the Spanish-American War, Spain and the United States, right? That one's pretty easy. For the Filipino War, it was the Philippines and the United States. Pretty easy stuff. It's going to be a little tougher for World War I and World War II. because there were a ton of participants. And some other things that I want to know. What were the causes? Okay, we've just talked about them, right? You've just filled those out. What were the causes? How did it end? And that's it. Okay? And that should take you a while. I mean, you're going to have to Google a lot of that information to go in there. So anyway, that's what I want you to do. I also want you to watch that video, which should be next after you watch me. So go ahead and do that, and I will be back on the airwaves, as they say, for Monday, and we will see you then. Hopefully, I will have this off. Take care. Bye-bye now.